Okay, I'm not sure a man who's been entertaining a group with stories and keeping these rapt faces out of their laptops needs an introduction. I also don't think the mic's working, so I'm going to put it down and just talk. Oh, how about this? Oh, photo op, here we go.
Improvise.
Again, okay.
We can improvise
This is
here.
awesome. It is, so I'm Karen May, for those of you I don't know. Oh, this is, wow, what an introduction. I manage our talent team, which is leadership development, learning and development, talent management, and so forth. And so what an honor for me to introduce this man I'm so close to. To introduce to you Sully Sullenberger, who you may know as a hero, and you may think of when you think of the word hero, but you may also think of as a leader, as a man who's an expert, who's responsible, who's creative, and who's able to lead a team through a significant crisis to a very good end, right? Yes, he's standing here, a very good end. But I wanted to highlight 3 other characteristics, leadership characteristics that really matter. The first is that he's a curious man. Even after extraordinary success, he stays curious. And the second is that he's focused on learning from others, even people who are quite different from him. And then the third is that he seeks to share that knowledge, to share what he learns. And he actually took this book that he wrote, Making a Difference, the one he's here to talk to us about, as an opportunity to interview people, 11 people that he admires, leaders that he admires, and to learn from them, and then in turn to share what he learned with the world. And he's here today to share that with you, and what an honor for us. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll just stay here.
That was a very nice introduction. Thank you. I'll try to live up to it. But yeah, I have been intellectually curious my whole life. And in the introduction to the second book, Making a Difference, Stories and Vision and Courage from America's Leaders, I talk about why that's the case, or why I think that's the case. And one of the reasons is that even before my birth, my family valued education. All 4 of my grandparents, and these are people who were born in the 1880s and 1890s, in the 19th century, went to college. And that was especially remarkable for women of that era. My mother was a first-grade teacher in the small town in Texas where I grew up. A first-grade teacher for 25 years. And so from her, I got wonderful lifelong gifts of a love of reading and of learning, and those have served me well throughout my career. And so I've tried to do what I've encouraged others to do, and that's to continue to invest in yourselves, to never stop learning, never stop growing, either professionally or personally throughout your life. And I think that's become a necessity now, because with the pace of change only accelerating, I think most people cannot get through an entire working lifetime with just one skill set. We have to keep learning, have to keep growing, sometimes reinvent ourselves, like I did on January 15th, 2009, to learn very quickly a way of living this entirely new life. On January 15, 2009, I had never given a public speech in my life, never wanted to. I was convinced I wouldn't be good at it. I had never written a book. I'd been a professional pilot, but it said curious. And so I approached these new careers, and I have 4 of them now to replace the airline career I left after 30 years, 2 years ago, as a speaker, as an author, as a consultant to industry, and as a CBS News aviation consultant. I approached that with the same discipline and diligence I did my flying career. And we seem to have lost the speaker in the room, or has it just been muted?
I think it's better without it.
Is it better without it?
I think we've got a little bit of speaker.
Okay, I've got just enough that you can hear me. Let me know if you can't.
Yeah.
Okay, so why this book and why now? I think like the first book, like Highest Duty, my memoir, a lot of this book was already in me, that I had lived my life in a way that had prepared me without knowing it for that event and for all this attention as a public figure in the aftermath. I'd been thoughtful. I grew up in an environment in which ideas were important, in which education was important, and striving for excellence was expected of me. And so, when I had these amazing opportunities to travel the world and meet world figures the last 3 years, and I began to hear these very personal stories, these moving and inspiring stories sometimes funny, but all of them, really, really incredible, about people who have changed the world, who have changed the lives of others, and done amazing things. I just had to share them. I had to put them on the page, and so that's why. And I intentionally chose a very diverse group of people from a variety of walks of life, younger and older, men, women, some well-known, some you've never heard of, but all people I admire and respect, all people who have certain things in common. One of the things they have in common is that I think they all view the world the same way. They view the world as an opportunity for good. And they're people who are willing to serve a cause greater than themselves, greater than their own immediate needs. They're people who, like one of them literally says, they're able to check their ego at the door. They're able to do things for the right reasons. And they're able to lead people. I think people deserve to be led. They want to be led. We may manage things, we may manage money, but we must lead people. And that requires human skills. Now some, especially in really evidence-based domains, and I've done a lot of patient safety work too, trying to apply what we've learned over the last century in aviation to medicine. Some in these evidence-based domains like medicine, think of these human skills as soft skills as opposed to hard skills or clinical or technical skills. But they're not really soft skills, they're human skills. And even in medicine, even in an evidence-based domain like that, these human skills have the potential to save more lives than technical skills do. Because much of what we're seeing in medicine right now is we have, like in so many industries, we have islands of excellence in a sea of systemic failures. We have some areas that are doing very well, some are very safe, and some that are not. And so I think these human skills are very important. And now when we as a society are facing huge and intractable and ambiguous and complicated problems that are going to require generations to solve, we need people now more than ever who can feel a sense of civic duty, who can be willing to share sacrifices, who can give us a vision of a possible future and help us to get there. And be, as Jennifer Granholm says, a former Michigan governor who I profile in the book, who can be more pragmatic and less dogmatic. So, with that in mind, I'll tell you a few stories about some of the people I profiled and why I chose them. And then I'd like to open it up into a wide-ranging discussion about what these people mean, what they've done, and what we can learn from them and take away as everyday things we can use in our lives. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book is to make it accessible. There are shelves full of leadership books, but many of them are written by or for CEOs or salespeople. But this book is for everybody. Whether you have a big job or a fancy title or not, that everybody can learn to be a leader, and everybody can learn to be a better leader than they are currently. The very first profile I do is of Admiral Thad Allen. You may know the name. He's a recently retired Coast Guard commandant, just about a contemporary of mine, maybe a year or two older. Spent his whole life serving others, saving lives. And he was the one brought in the darkest hours of the federal response to Hurricane Katrina to turn it around. It was in chaos. It was uncoordinated. The rescue workers were being beaten up in the press on a daily basis. They were completely demoralized. And so when he finally got to New Orleans, he turned to his military aide, who happened to be, interestingly enough, named Katrina. And she said, "Well, Admiral, now that we're here, what are you going to do?" And he said, "I'm going to do the first thing that any new commander does. I'm going to call an all-hands meeting." And she said, "Admiral, there are 4,000 people in this building." He said, "Well, I want you to gather as many of them in one place as you can, and I want to talk to them right now." And so on the first floor of this large building, they gathered 2,500 people. And as he entered the area, he saw faces almost hanging on the floor. And so he stood up on a desk, he grabbed a microphone, and then with a very simple message in just a few words, he said, I want you to listen to me. I'm going to give you a direct order. I want you to treat everyone you encounter as if they were a member of your immediate family, as if they were your father, your mother, your brother, your sister. And if you do that, two things are going to happen. First, if you make a mistake, you're going to err on the side of doing too much, not too little. And second, if anyone has a problem with what you've done, then their problem's with me and not with you. And he said you could hear a huge collective sigh of relief. People actually began to weep because nobody before that had told them that what they were doing was important or why, or that their boss was behind them. And in just a few words, he had done that. For a very graphic exercise of leadership by his personal example. And he did the same thing again with the BP oil spill in the Gulf and with the response to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And that's just one story, one profile in the first chapter of the book. And there's so many that are like that. Robert Reich was here, I know, and spoke to you last August. I had an extended conversation with him. I've admired him for many years. And my conversation with him at his office over at Berkeley was by far the most intellectually stimulating of them all. It was almost a Socratic dialogue. And we talked about many themes. He talked about where he got his inspiration. He's a little bit older than I. And in the early 1960s, during the civil rights movement, one of his close friends, a mentor, a man a little bit older than he, is Mickey Schwerner, who you may remember was murdered along with two other civil rights workers in Mississippi. That led to the story in the movie Mississippi Burning. And when Bob learned about this man's death, it shocked him to the core that such evil could exist in our country in this time. And he made a promise to himself that he would do what he had the inclination to do, and what he said was an assumption that he would do. He would assume that he would spend his life in what he calls public service. Now that sounds like an archaic term, doesn't it? It's not one we commonly hear these days. But that's literally what he means, that he intended to spend his life serving the public. It wasn't that he was going to go into politics or become a politician or to work in government. His goal was to be a public servant, which is what he did. He relates to me another example of his personal leadership. When he first got to the Labor Department as the new Labor Secretary under President Clinton, he had a meeting with his staff, and he opened it up to questions. A large group of employees at the Labor Department. And someone asked, Mr. Secretary, why do we still have time cards? Why do we have to mess with that? What's the purpose of that? And so he canvassed his lieutenants, and they decided that there really wasn't a purpose to the time cards. And so he said, okay, starting next week, no more time cards. And people were stunned. But then more suggestions came, and people became more engaged and had other ways to make things better and more productive and more useful. And one of the best ideas that came out of this kind of meeting was to, as changes to the economy took place, to try to very quickly identify which jobs were likely to go away and never come back, and which jobs in which someone could be quickly retrained to do something else similar, and then to redeploy the forces and the resources to do the most good, to be essentially doing triage. One name that you haven't heard is Sue Sheridan. And through my patient safety work, I became familiar with her story through a physician friend of mine. Sue Sheridan is a mother of two from Boise, Idaho. And the reason I profile her is because her family endured two awful and preventable medical tragedies. First, her son Cal, when he was born, as many babies do, became jaundiced. He wasn't diagnosed, he wasn't tested, he wasn't treated in time, and he suffered brain damage. He has cerebral palsy. and he would require special care the rest of his life. And not long after that, her husband, Pat, had a tumor that they were initially told was benign. He had surgery to remove of it, as much of it as could be done. And then when the tumor recurred, the surgeons at that time wondered why he wasn't treated for cancer earlier, at the time of his first surgery. And they kept saying, well, because we were told it was benign. And after about the third or fourth doctor or pathologist asked her the same question, why wasn't he treated earlier for cancer? She went down to the records room and checked out his records herself and saw on the original pathology report malignant sarcoma. And so again, a systemic breakdown in communication led to a fatality. And as he was dying, he made her promise to go kick some ass, to save others from that fate, and to change the world. And so rather than devolve into bitterness, anger, and despair, as many would feel every right to do, she educated herself. She gained allies. She took on the often imperious medical establishment as a mom. And she single-handedly managed to change the care that we give newborns globally. And she now has a new job that I helped her get as a patient safety advocate as part of the World Health Organization. It's amazing what people can do when they choose to. So, so that's why I wrote the book. And for me, that's what it's about. It's that each of us can choose to do these things. Each of us can learn to be more fulfilled at work, to be better leaders at home, at school, or at work. So I'd love to take your questions. We have some mics that will pass through the room, and if we all can't hear you clearly, then I'll repeat the question. How about right over here? Yes, sir. I remember seeing you before. Good to see you again.
I am on. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming. You, in terms of making a difference, you in a single day went from being an airline pilot getting ready to retire to becoming an advocate for aviation safety. I'm wondering. So you've been making good use of the bully pulpit to say, these are things that we are seeing wrong with the way airlines are regulated, with the way pilots and flight crews are being compensated and recognized. Are you starting to see any progress, any response from from policymakers and from the airlines to that work?
Some. The answer in order is yes from some of the policymakers and pretty much no from the industry. We have in this country a formal lessons learned process through the National Transportation Safety Board, an independent federal agency that investigates major transportation accidents, not just airlines, but rail, pipeline, highway, and others. As a result of the final report on Flight 1549, the final report was issued just about 2 years ago. Some 24 recommendations were made to make the system safer, to make this kind of an accident less likely to happen in the future. And let me ask you what you think the result has been. Of those 24 recommendations made by this independent agency that's charged with making the recommendations but cannot themselves implement them, it's the province of our regulatory agency, the FAA, to change the rules and the airlines to adopt them. Of the 24, how many do you think have been implemented thus far? How many think that half have been? Raise your hands. How many think 5 have been? Gosh, you guys are a cynical bunch. How many think 2 have been? Okay. And how many think 1 has been? Does anybody think none has been? You're right. You're right. Thus far, none of the recommendations has been implemented. And so to get back to your question, right now, aviation is ultra safe. But if we're going to keep it at that level and make it better, which is what we should be doing, because our passengers deserve and expect it. We've got to do more work than we're doing right now. Unfortunately, just a month after our flight, in February 2009 in Buffalo, New York, there was a crash that claimed 50 lives, the Continental Connection, Colgan Air 3407. 49 on the airplane and 1 person on the ground whose house the crash hit. The families of the victims of the Colgan Air crash have been ardent and tireless advocates of safety, and they've been very active lobbying legislators on the Capitol Hill. They've been lobbying the airline industry, and it's largely through their efforts, with some help from me and my first officer on my flight, Jeff Skiles, that we've got through the Congress 2 bills that passed in the fall of 2009 and the summer of 2010 that have required greater experience for pilots, especially the young pilots at the regional airlines, from the unbelievably low minimum level now of 250 hours to be an airline pilot. It's laughably small, to at least 1,500 hours, and also to improve the rules that prevent pilot fatigue. But you know what? The airline industry and their lobbyists are fighting as hard as they can, tooth and nail. They're spending millions of dollars to fight this, to weaken it, to delay it, to kill it. I've had them personally call me liar. I've had them, fight everywhere they can to say that this isn't necessary, that we really, it's okay the way it is, it's good enough, and of course it isn't. So we're fighting entrenched interests who have a big financial stake in the status quo, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. And unfortunately, in our society, like every other, it almost takes a crisis to focus the public attention and the political will to get these things done. And as we recede in time from these events, and we get back to business as normal, and those that we're opposing can say, well, we haven't killed anybody lately, so we're doing everything okay. And we're saying you can't define safety only that way. You have to look proactively at the risks and mitigate them. It's going to be an ongoing battle. Yes, sir.
It seems to me like the NTSB is unusually competent and effective if underpowered, whereas the FAA suffers from regulatory capture and terrible inertia and bureaucracy. You can be forgiven if you want to punt on this question because it's political, but why do you think that the NTSB has that spark, whereas the FAA is, like many other regulatory agencies, not?
I think it's twofold. First, the NTSB is an independent agency. It's somewhat more insulated from the political process, although not completely by any means. And also, just a practical matter, the rulemaking agency, the FAA, is the one that's going to impose costs on the operators. It's the one that's going to make the rules that determine how much it costs them to operate in accordance with the new standards, how inconvenient it is for them. And of course, the industry and their lobbyists are fighting anything that's deemed to be either the least bit more costly or the least bit more inconvenient for them, and that they view as a regulatory burden, quite frankly. And so I think it's just a matter of practicality. It's the rulemaking process where the differences are made, and that's where the costs are going to be felt. So I think it's not just the FAA. I think that many of the federal agencies have that problem. And I think it's, whether it's in the financial world, where we're seeing these kinds of things happen, or on Capitol Hill, the influence of money is too great in our society. And I'm not going to punt on a political question, even though this is not a really political book. I don't shy away from answering or addressing important questions that people care about that affect our lives. And the influence of money is too great in our entire political system. And it's even worse now after that wrong-headed Supreme Court decision in Citizens United that gives corporations the ability to donate unlimited sums and super PACs. And it disenfranchises the rest of us because the lobbyists can get the rules written in their favor. And it's not in the favor of the traveling public. It's not in the favor of the average American. It's in favor of specific industries or specific companies.
On a more hopeful note, do you know of any recipe to have more agencies like the NTSB that could perhaps help to regulate the financial industry and some of the other risk areas where it wouldn't suffer from these same political shenanigans?
I think having longer terms would help. and having appointees that are more based on competence and not political affiliation. Again, I get back to my response to when people have on occasion asked me my political affiliation. And I anticipated very early on, 3 years ago plus, that question would eventually be asked. I've been shocked and surprised that it's been asked only twice in 3.5 years. But I had a ready answer, and it's not a flippant one, it's a real answer. When people ask me if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I say I'm an American, and I think as an American, and I vote as an American, and I wish more of us did that. Yes, ma'am, back here in the back.
Yeah, hi.
I'm sorry, we had somebody else first?
Oh.
Go for the mic.
My question for you is about how we can teach the next generation leadership. So you mentioned in your book that it's meant to be very accessible. It's for all of us. It's not accessible. And I'm sure that's true for younger generation. But you talk about your daughters, and I'm just curious if you could share with us how we can teach leadership to that next generation.
Through your own personal example, by modeling the behavior you want to see in them. They are not going to listen to what you say as much as what they'll watch what you do. And our daughters now are 19 and 17. And my wife is a wonderful partner and a wonderful mom. And I think part of the reason that they turn out the way they are is it's in their DNA. And my daughters are adopted, so they're not biologically related to us directly. But part of who we are is our DNA, but that's only a part of it. But my wife has done a great job of being there for them, mentoring them. We read to them from a very early age and cuddled with them even before they could understand the words. And it was really fun to see them then try to, quote, read even before they could to their stuffed animals or their dolls, or the older one to the younger one, mimicking what we had done with them. So I would say just act around them the way you want them to act, in every way. The words you choose, the way you treat shopkeepers or people you pass on the highway. Whatever it is, they will notice what you've done. It's one of the things I say in the book about my time as a captain and practicing for 22 years as a captain out of my 30 years as an airline pilot. Meeting a new group of people, a new crew every week, and trying to quickly take this collection of individuals, some of whom may not even know each other, and form a team. So if something bad happens on the first takeoff, we can work together effectively and solve the problem. And I say in the book that few interactions with others went unnoticed or were completely without consequence. People notice those things. Or as I say about my friend Chris, who died of cancer 3 years ago, and I spoke at his memorial service. Chris was able to live his life in such a way that his values were apparent. He didn't have to tell you what he believed. You could see in his actions and his attitudes what he believed. That would be it, I think. Yes, over here.
You mentioned that people you interviewed for this book that you admire. Be sure that if someday I write a book like this, you will be one of the persons I would like to interview.
Thank you.
But my question is that is there any person or story that you wanted to put in the book that you weren't able to? Any random reason?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Fortunately, just about everybody I asked to interview said yes. They were very anxious to be a part of this process, which was wonderful. Are there stories that I would like to have included that didn't have time to? Well, yes, absolutely. There was one I touch on briefly. One of the people I really wanted to interview and wasn't able to make our schedules mesh was now the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, the former 4-star Army General, Chief of Staff of the Army, Eric Shinseki. He, as a young infantry officer in Vietnam, badly wounded, lost part of one foot, served with distinction throughout his entire career, rose to the highest rank in the Army, and as Veterans Affairs Secretary, trying to do his very best to give the best care for our veterans that we can. One thing in particular really caught my attention about him in terms of his personal moral courage. Early in 2003, before the March invasion of Iraq, he was asked to testify before Congress about the numbers of ground troops that would be required to control, to pacify the country after the invasion phase was over. He testified truthfully, forthrightly about the fact that several 100,000 would be required, which was a much larger number than then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was publicly stating, along with the rest of the administration. And he paid a professional price for that. Ended up retiring and leaving and not being able to continue. And I think that was just a perfect example of the kind of moral courage that I'm talking about, that I admire in many of these people. I would like to have told more of his story and interviewed him personally, and I wasn't able to make our schedules work. I'll go to you in a minute.
Question about when you actually were landing the plane. I imagine there may have been times where, I think you said it was very cool that you were following a set of processes and training that you had earlier, but I wonder whether you also had to break rules and processes and potentially handle conflict perhaps with other co-pilots about what you should do. Was there conflict with the rules and processes with any other members of the crew you had to handle, and how did you make the choices?
That's a great question. It's a big question. I'll try to distill it down to its essential elements. What happened to us on January 15, 2009 on Flight 1549 was extraordinary. It was very rare statistically to have an airliner hit either so many birds or such large birds that it basically disabled it and damaged the engines, it turns out, irreparably, leading to an engines out emergency landing in water just 208 seconds after we hit them, just under 3.5 minutes. So that was something, it was a novel and unanticipated event for which we had never specifically trained. So it was very much outside the box. And there wasn't an exact protocol to follow in that case. And so, yes, it required a great deal of improvisation. It required a great deal of deciding that many of the things that we're taught to do in less dire situations weren't really appropriate in that situation. I'll try to go through a few of them really quickly. The fact that this happened so soon, just 100 seconds after takeoff, at such a low altitude, about 2,700 feet, with so few options over this one of the most densely developed, populated areas of the planet, Manhattan, meant that we had to act very quickly, very decisively, to make tough choices, to get them right immediately based upon imperfect and ambiguous information. The big advantage that we had was that unlike some other situations, unlike Air France 447, for example, where there was some ambiguity about exactly what was going on, we knew clearly exactly what had happened, exactly why, and what that entailed for us. There was no doubt about what had happened. So that part of the situation was actually very clear and relatively easy. The difficult part was that the stress levels were so high that they were marginally debilitating. It didn't leave me with the ability to do the math on the altitude and distance, quite frankly. So what I did was I relied upon my experience of having flown thousands of flights, 20,000 hours, and I was able to look out the window over my shoulder, look at the nearer runways, and say, no, and be right. Very quickly under those conditions was remarkable, because the NTSB, as is their charter, spent a year and a half thoroughly investigating every aspect of this, including computer simulations, to determine if theoretically we had enough energy, we had enough altitude speed, the 1/2 mv squared part of it, the kinetic energy, to make it to a runway, taking into account human reaction time. Turns out we did not, by a little bit. After remember when you were a kid and they would say, don't get into trouble, we'll put it on your permanent record? Well, if there is such a thing, it's probably having an NTSB report written about you, and where they literally scrutinize for a year and a half every thought that we had every syllable we uttered, every choice we made, every action we took, and to have us be vindicated after that process, I was very happy with. One of the other things that we did that's not typical is in a less dire emergency, it's thought best, and based upon the data we've had, the studies that have been done, for the captain not to fly the airplane, but to be the decision maker, to take in the whole situation, be aware of all the critical parameters, to make a choice, announce it, and begin directing the first officer to take certain actions. There wasn't time for that. The workload was so intense, the time pressure so extreme, that Jeff Skiles, my first officer, and I never had time to even discuss the situation. We had to simply to act. And so it was best that I fly rather than try to direct him, because there wasn't time. And so I called for the checklist. I began making a left turn, started taking actions by memory, because there wasn't time to, again, one of the other protocols we deviated from was, rather than wait until a minute plus later, over a third of the way through the remaining flight time, when we finally got to this part of the checklist where we first would start taking remedial actions, like turning on engine ignition, starting the auxiliary power unit to provide a backup source of electrical generation. I took them in the first 2 seconds by memory. So, but there were several ways that we deviated from the normal course of things just due to the exigencies. And that was critical. Had I not done so, we couldn't have had as good an outcome. This whole thing was one series of improvisations after another, but done based upon 42 years of flying, 20,000 hours in the air, and having a clear understanding of the end state I was going to achieve, and knowing knowing which options were possible and which ones were not, by looking out the window and being right. So that's what we did. Now, there was a question up here that we've been neglecting.
What would you suggest
Go
to
ahead,
engineers? What do you suggest to engineers who are working on safety critical systems?
I'm sorry, one more time.
What could you suggest to engineers who are working on safety critical systems?
A couple of things. I would say to engineers who are working on safety critical systems, to realize that just as in medicine, just as in aviation, just as in many other critical industries, what we have now are human technology systems that must function together seamlessly. And we need to involve the end users as early as possible in the system design. We need to take advantage of the limitations and the abilities of the technology and of the humans, and assign them appropriate roles accordingly. For example, in aviation, as in many domains, technology is great. It affords us wonderful functionality, wonderful displays of information, high levels of integration of electronic connectedness. But the downside of that is that technology, for the most part, can only do what has been foreseen and programmed. It's humans who can innovate. And by the way, my favorite definition of innovation is changing before you're forced to, by regulation, by competition, by circumstance. And so what we did that day was to innovate, and some, the technology helped us to some extent, but it was basically manually flying, making choices, in terms of our human capabilities. So I would say keep the human factor in mind, that your engineering can be top rate, first rate, and if you don't take into account sufficiently or appropriately how humans are going to use it, the fact that humans are going to make mistakes, and your systems need to be tolerant of that, and to make them as least likely as possible, then you can still fail, and fail spectacularly if you don't do that. Yes, sir?
With that in mind, how do you feel about Airbus's program flight envelope, how it takes away the freedom of the pilot to
The short answer is I prefer Boeing's philosophy, which is that when you approach certain limitations, it will warn you. The stick may shake or it may make a noise, but if you must go beyond that to avoid hitting the ground, to avoid a collision, it's possible to do so. People have asked me if we would have had a similar outcome in a Boeing airplane that day, and my answer is I think we would have, as long as it was, the general geometric layout was similar, the airplane shape and size was similar, we would have had a similar outcome. The Airbus I was flying was a fly-by-wire airplane in which there's no longer a direct mechanical connection between the flight controls in the cockpit and the flight control surfaces in the wings and tail. Instead, there are flight control computers that interpret and mediate the pilot's inputs and then send electrical impulses to actuators that move the control surfaces. The flight envelope protections that the Airbus fly-by-wire system affords us, we didn't need because we never got to the maximums at which it would have essentially protected us from exceeding certain limitations. And in one important way, it hindered us, and this has not been well known. And we looked at the digital flight data recorder that has all kinds of streams of data of all the flight control positions, altitude, airspeed, acceleration, etc. And in the last 4 seconds of the flight, that's right before we touched down, I was not yet achieving the maximum lift from the wings. I was commanding more, pulling back full aft on the stick, and the flight control computers prevented me from getting more lift. Therefore, we hit harder than we would have. There was more damage underneath. More water came in sooner. One structural piece of metal was driven up through the back floor, which cut Doreen Welch's, the flight attendant's leg. And so that was not the way we were trained it would work. And it turns out there's a little known software feature known only then to a few Airbus software engineers and to no pilots, no airlines, that this was the case. It's called a phugoid mode. And it was not the way we were trained the airplane should work. Apparently it is the way the airplane does work, but that was not apparent to us. And so in that sense, it actually hurt us.
Was it in direct law?
No, he's asking if we were in direct law. There were three categories of sophistication that are possible in the Airbus flight control system. The highest level, the normal level, is called normal law, in which everything is working and all these flight envelope protections are intact. It prevents you from going too fast or too slow, getting the nose too high or too low, too much bank, too much acceleration in terms of G. In alternate law, you have some of those protections, not all of them. It's a degraded mode, but the flight control protections are still somewhat active. In direct law, none of the flight control protections is active. It's possible to aerodynamically stall the wing. It won't prevent you from doing that, and it flies more like a more conventional airplane. Now, we stayed in normal law the entire time because in the first 2 seconds I started our airplane's auxiliary power unit, and by the time the left engine speed, RPMs, decayed below the point at which the left generator was continuing to power all our electrical buses, the APU generator was online. And so we remained in normal law. All those protections were intact.
So we don't care about Republican or Democrat, just Airbus versus Boeing.
Okay. All right, let's see who else. There must be some others. Yes, sir, right here.
So you had mentioned about increasing flight time requirements from 250 hours to 1,500 hours.
Yes.
So what kind of advice would you give to younger pilots to get through that grind, who dream of being an airline pilot?
How do you get from if you want to be a pilot, how do you get from 250 hours to 1,500 hours? Well, I think you'll do the same thing that we've always done. And if you don't go through the military, which there are fewer options now, and even if you decide to go that route, you owe the military more years, I think up to 12 now versus the 5 or 6 it used to be. You'll have to do something else. But there are jobs out there, and I think in one way there probably are a few better situations. It used to be that you would go to one type of an operation to fly, maybe be a flight instructor in small single-engine propeller airplanes for a while, and then you would change companies, you'd go somewhere else to fly as co-pilot in a turboprop doing charters, and then eventually you would fly a Learjet someplace else. Now there are a few more operations where it's more vertically integrated, and you'll have more options to progress within that same company. But it's a difficult thing to do, you're right. But there are options, in spite of what the Regional Airlines Association lobbyists say, there are options besides just flying banner tow along the beach or being a flight instructor in small single-engine airplanes. But it's always been hard, and it's no easier now. But does it really matter? I mean, would you want to put your kids on a regional jet where the first officer has 250 hours? I wouldn't. I mean, it doesn't matter how hard it is. It's what's required. Yes.
Do you think a less experienced pilot would have had a prayer?
I think it would have been much harder. I think in every way, whether it had been night, whether it had still been snowing, whether we were a little bit further from the river, if any of those things had changed, it would have been much harder. And had I had with me, well, I'm assuming you're talking about both pilots, had the captain been less experienced, it might not have been as hardwired in his or her brain a way of synthesizing a lifetime of experience and training to come up with a way to solve this new problem you've never seen before in 208 seconds. Had I had a less experienced first officer, I still wouldn't have had time to direct them. So it would have meant I would have had to do more things myself, which I probably really couldn't have done because I was maxed out. And I wouldn't have had as much help because Jeff Skiles had also been a captain before on a 737 before all the cutbacks forced him back into the right seat to be a first officer again. He also had 20,000 hours of flying time like I did. And so he intuitively and immediately grasped the situation as it developed as I did. I didn't have to tell him what was going on. He saw it, we knew it. He was able to listen to my conversation with the air traffic controller on the radio and infer my intent. He knew intuitively and immediately to shift his priorities on his own initiative. I didn't have a chance to tell him late in the flight to stop trying to regain usable thrust using the checklist with what turned out to be these irreparably damaged engines. And instead, by calling out airspeed and altitude to me, he helped me judge that final critical maneuver, the height above the river, judging it visually, at which I would begin raising the nose to start to land. If I waited too long, we'd hit too hard. Wouldn't have got the nose up enough. If I began to raise the nose too soon, we'd get too slow and drop it and hit too hard. So he had to call out the airspeed and altitude to me to help me judge that critical height. So had either one of us been not as experienced, we could not have had as good an outcome, and every part of it would have been harder. That's why you know, we make it look so easy being an airline pilot because so much goes so right so much of the time. But at any given moment, you have to be able to handle whatever the cosmos throws at you, even if it's never been thought of before, and get it right the first time. That's our job. And that's why experience matters. Are we out of time?
We're out of time, so big round of applause.
Thank you.